Raja, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Raja, I'm just going to briefly introduce you to everybody, but I'm sure for most of us it won't be necessary, but we hope to have new attenders, new listeners, new readers here, as it were. Raja, you were born three years or so after the Palestinian catastrophe, the Nakba. You were born in Ramallah in the West Bank, where your family had fled after that catastrophe from Jaffa as the Jewish forces swept through Palestine. And your first years were spent under the Jordanian period of annexation. You went to Bir Zayt College, then the American University of Beirut, studying English literature, and later took a degree your law degree in London. Your father, who is very much the focus of your book, Aziz, was a lawyer with a long and strong record of fighting against injustice, against the British during the Mandate years, against the Hashemite forces that annexed the West Bank and East Jerusalem in 1948, and then, of course, against the Israelis after the 1967 war and subsequent occupation annexation. In 1979, you helped set up Al-Haq, the justice NGO defending Palestinian victims of Israeli occupation, an institution admired and followed throughout Palestine and worldwide. But since October 2021, the Israelis have called it a terrorist organization. And I guess this is almost certainly because of Al-Haq's strong and long record of successes against Israeli rule in the civil and human rights field. You've written a great number of books, as Dia's already said, celebrating and evoking Palestine, such as Palestinian Walks in 2008, and 10 years later, Where the Line is Drawn, Crossing Boundaries in Occupied Palestine. Now We Could Have Been Friends, My Father and I, which was published here in the UK last autumn and is to be published in the United States in the coming spring. Raja, there's a lot to talk about, but I'd like to start with what I think the Balfour Project and many Palestinians like to do best, that is grounding us, as it were, and going back in time and looking through the eyes of your father, whose first antagonists were the forces of the British Mandate Authority. That must have been a most dangerous time for him. Can you tell us about that? Can we start there, Raja?
My father knew very well about the British Mandate and the rules of the British Mandate. And in 1936, he wrote this small publication, which is called ABC, the Arab Case in Palestine, an exposition of the Arab case in concise and readable form, which it is hoped will be a step towards a deeper and more widespread interest in the Arab side of the question. This little publication I discovered only recently, actually, and it was one of the motivations for me for writing the book that we're discussing today. My father knew very well about the British and their intrigues in Palestine, and in going through his papers and in researching this book, I found out that there was a secret meeting in London in February 1948, when Ernest Bevin, the UK Foreign Secretary, gave King Abdullah the green light to snatch part of Palestine, provided that the King forces stayed out of those areas allotted by the UN partition plan to the Jews. So from that time, the British were conspiring to deprive the Palestinians of their country, not only through the Balfour Declaration, but also through employing King Abdullah to snatch, as I said, parts of the Palestine that was given essentially to the Palestinians in the partition scheme. And then, of course, in order to make sure that this happens, John Bagot Glubb was appointed as head of the army in Jordan, and he made sure that the secret agreement that Bevin had reached with King Abdullah would be complied with. And so when the fighting in Palestine, in Lid and Ramleh, happened, the fighters there needed support from the Arab Legion, the Jordanian army. And Glubb refused to give them this support. And as a result, they were forced out at gunpoint and had to walk from Lid to Ramallah entirely on foot. And so my father knew all of this and was sure that something had to be done by the Palestinians to make sure that the Palestinians get a state of their own. But he was overpowered by this, and he couldn't get to that point at any point in his life.
Going back even further, Raja, your father had actually been up against the British Mandate forces during the Palestinian uprising in the mid-1930s, hadn't he? A great risk to himself.
Yes, he started his law practice by supporting the fighters and giving free legal advice and free defending them their cases without return. And so he used to tell me that he would go into the orchards, the orange orchards, where they were hiding at night, and he would take their statements and the compiled evidence from them. And this was at great risk, because anyone who supported what the British called terrorists, who were fighters for the Arab cause in the 36 revolt, would be tried and given very harsh sentence and possibly even executed. So from that time, he was being very courageous and supporting the Palestinian cause, and at great risk to himself.
There's an interesting piece, an excerpt in your book, and I'll just read it out because I think it says a lot about both the British and the Jordanians before we get onto the Israeli occupation. You say that when the Arab Legion took over the West Bank, Jordan declared military rule there. Reading the first orders made by the Jordanian military governor, I was reminded of the first orders issued by the Israeli governor after Israel occupied the West Bank and placed it under military rule. In both cases, it was declared that the laws in force would remain until amended or abolished. This meant that the Defense Emergency Regulations of 1945, just while the British were in charge, issued by the British during the last years of the mandate, were considered as remaining in force. They provided for the possibility of indefinite administrative detention, which is what, of course, we still have today. So in a sense, a lot of it does go back to the British, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And we're still stuck with that British defense regulation, which Israel uses all the time. And so it does go back to the British. And that's something that my father was very aware of, and I became aware of as I researched this book.
Now, when the British left Palestine in 1948, or I wish say left, we should say just abandoned it, one of the things which your father became involved in, I'd like you to tell us about. One of the more gratuitous offenses the British made against the Palestinians was that 3 months before Israel actually established itself as a state, was to declare that they were separating the pound from the sterling area, thus making the Palestinian pound absolutely useless for the Palestinians. I mean, that was an extraordinary thing to do, but it obviously left hundreds of thousands of Palestinians completely bereft of their savings and any financial support. But your father subsequently became involved in that, didn't he?
Yes, but I want to say, quoting from Walid Khaldi, that the British mandate was the shabbiest colonial rule ever, shabbiest regime in colonial history. This is Walid Khaldi describing the regime in Palestine by the British. And I think
Walid, the great Palestinian historian,
yeah, the shabbiest regime in colonial history. So what happened was that in 48, in February 48, there was a British Treasury announcement with no prior notice or explanation that would exclude Palestinian from the sterling, Palestine from the sterling area, and suspend the free convertibility of the Palestinian pound into pound sterling. Because prior to that, the Palestinian pound was equal to the pound sterling. And there was a single currency between Transjordan and Palestine, a single currency area. So when the British made this announcement, there was a rush on the banks to take out the money. And by March 48, Palestinian pound was rendered unconvertible into any other currency. So Arab clients of the Jaffa branch of the Ottoman Bank, for example, were asking the bank to pay them their balances in Amman, where they had left, forced out by the Zionist forces, and elsewhere where they were in Cyprus, in the West, anywhere. And many of them left without any money and without any credit. And they thought that they could simply withdraw their money from the banks in Jaffa, for example, and other areas in Palestine. But Israel ordered the banks to freeze the accounts of all their Arab customers and to stop all transactions on Arab accounts. And the British went along with this and accepted and froze the accounts and refused to allow the banks to give out the money to their clients. And so my father studied the matter, and he realized that the Arab Bank had made a case in London against he made a case in London to get the money out, but the case was failed. And so he studied the matter and tried to find loopholes and ways of dealing with the matter, and then raised another case in Jordan against Barclays Bank, against the Ottoman Bank. And this case was successful, and he was able to unfreeze the accounts of all Arab customers and to stop and to allow force the Israelis to give out the money to their clients. And the British then employed Sir Hartley Shawcross to defend the case, and my father was very unimpressed with that man, and he fought against him in the courts and succeeded, and was very happy to have succeeded in this case, which became a very important case in the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and one of the few and first cases that the Palestinians won against Israel, and that's as early as 1954. 52.
That's a marvelous record for your father. It must have taken something to go up against the whole British establishment, especially as personified by Hartley Shawcross, who was a great towering sort of typical British colonial figure, wasn't he?
Absolutely.
Yeah. But I'd like to, on that note, I'd like to know a little bit more about those years under Jordanian rule, because nowadays we hear, of course, about Israeli occupation. The Jordanian period, annexation, occupation, whatever you call it, has rather faded into the realms of history. People don't talk about it. And I suppose a lot of people here might think that the Palestinians would have been happier under Jordanian occupation, or as they were with fellow Arabs. But what was it really like? I mean, you were a young man growing up, you were in school, and you were a teenager during the Jordanian period. What was it like under Jordanian occupation, and how did your father get on in that period?
Well, many of the readers of my book who were contemporaries, my contemporaries who experienced life under the Jordanian regime in after 48 have agreed with what I've written, and supplied me with more cases of suppression by the Jordanians. You see, it started with December 1st, 1948. There was a conference in Jericho, and the king wanted to show that the Palestinians had expressed their allegiance to him. And in fact, Sheikh Jabari from Hebron stressed in his speech that the king was master of the Palestinians' destiny. My father, on the other hand, was part of a gathering in Ramallah, which expressed reluctance to give the king an unconditional surrender. And he went and read that speech which the people gathering in Ramallah had prepared, and told the King Abdullah that they will not give him unconditional surrender. They will give him a conditional arrangement pending the liberation of the rest of Palestine. And the king was very angry by this, and he said what is known famous statement, مبايعتكم ردت إليكم. Your pledges of allegiance are returned to you. In other words, he did not need them. And so from that point, my father became a persona non grata gratis in Jordan, and he always suffered under the Jordanian regime because of his supposed unwillingness to submit to their rules. After the Jericho conference, the country expanded and changed its name from Transjordan to Jordan, and full annexation took place on 24 April 1950, replacing the Jordanian military rule, which as you said, resembled very much in the orders, the first orders, the orders that the Israelis made after the 1967. And then the Jordanian rule of the West Bank was very discriminatory. So every time anybody wanted to make a factory or a project of any sort, they would apply for permits, and they would be told, go and make this project in Amman rather than in Jerusalem or in the West Bank. And likewise, there was discrimination against Jerusalem. So land registration, for example, was not finished, and land use plans were not developed, and so all the area around Jerusalem remained unregistered. And the area around Jerusalem also, the jurisdiction of the area was not expanded. And this fell into the hands of the Israelis after 1967, because when they came, they found that the slopes of the French Hill and Mount Scopus were almost entirely empty of buildings. And so they were able to fill them up with settlements and annex, of course, as we know, that part of East Jerusalem.
So the Jordanians, in a sense, had tried to put the whole focus of what was left of Palestine into Amman, into the East Bank, and neglected the rest of Palestine, neglected, the part we now know as the West Bank, the occupied territories, and East Jerusalem. They took the focus away.
Yes, and they left the area here underdeveloped, and that's as far as the civil matters went. But then also there was a lot of suppression and oppression and torture of prisoners who tried to make any attempts at rebellion, and there was a lot of torture and a lot of imprisonment, and several of the elections that took place, like the one in 54, was rigged, and they would not allow the people who they did not like to win the elections, including my father and other people. And so altogether, it was a very difficult life under Jordan during that period, and that is not something that many people, as you said, know about. Those who grew up in that area in that time know it, but it's not something that is common knowledge. But it's very real and very true and very discouraging.
And your father was actually exiled, wasn't he, for a time?
Yes, my father, as a reward of winning the case of the blocked accounts, ended up being exiled and stayed outside of the country for almost 3 years. And he had a very hard time because he had to go from one place to another without much money, and our family here was also distressed and were unsure that he would ever be allowed to return. And it was a very difficult time for him and for us, and that was really like a reward for his having won the case. While he was in London, he tried to he wrote a memo to the Labour Party members of the Parliament, and tried to inform them about what was happening in Jordan under the rule of Glubb Pasha. John Bagot Glubb was called Glubb Pasha. And he tried to explain what was the situation in the West Bank, and how, and he assumed, he said, that the British do not know what is happening in their name, the torture that's happening in their name, the suppression of democracy, the suppression of development, and he was informing them so that they would take action to stop these measures and withdraw and take out Glubb Pasha from the area. And this, of course, made matters worse for him, because Glubb was in control of the situation here. And so that made it even worse for him.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting to me, that part of your book, because Glubb was seen as a great hero here. I was a schoolboy when he was made governor of my school when King Hussein threw him out in 1956. And of course, here in Britain, we all, knowing very little about the situation, he was regarded as a great hero, and that the Arabs had done the dirty on him, and this great Englishman who'd done so much for the Arabs, etc., 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 was being treated disgracefully. We haven't heard your side of the story, which I strongly suspect is the correct one, that in fact he was basically a colonialist enforcer for the Hashemite regime on behalf of the British, one remove.
Absolutely, absolutely. And he also was the one who established the Jaffer desert prison, which my father was incarcerated in when he was taken in 1954 and placed there, 1958 rather, and placed there for 3 months in the heat of summer in the desert. And that was a very harsh experience for my father, and that prison was established by Glubb Pasha. It was his brainchild.
I want to come back to your father later on, because obviously he's very much the center of this book, at the center of this book, and your relationship with him is fascinating. And I suspect that the fact that he was away from the family and away from you so much did create something of a divide between you. But at this stage, I'd like to come forward a little bit in time to the time when in 1967, of course, you would have been a young man by then. The Israelis came in and took over, occupied the West Bank, they occupied Jerusalem, they occupied the Golan Heights, and of course, the Sinai Desert. But for your purposes, they took the rest of Palestine in 1967. What do you remember of that time? And can you sort of take us through that period, you as a young man experiencing that?
Well, it was a harsh experience because I was 16 years old. I just turned 16, and we were placed under curfew for day and night. And so it was very confining and very difficult. And we were unsure what's going to happen. And the uncertainty made life so much more difficult, of course. And at the same time, my father, at that point, realized that his hopes for the liberation of Palestine by the Arab countries was a false hope. And he decided that the only way for the Palestinians was to establish their own state. And he decided that Israel is a reality, and it's not going to be possible to eliminate Israel, and no superpower would allow this to happen anyway. So might as well make peace with Israel, and based on two states, an Arab state, a Palestinian state, and an Israeli state side by side, and resolve the other problems of the Palestinians' return, and so on and so on and so on. And so he immediately proposed this to the Israelis by he got together 50 Palestinian leaders from all over the West Bank and Gaza, and they made a petition in which they put forward the plan and submitted it to the Israeli government that this is the way to make peace for between the Palestinians and the Israelis. Of course, the Israeli government was not interested, and neither was Jordan, nor were the Palestinians in the PLO, and so the plan got nowhere.
So soon after that, though, soon after the occupation started, you were able to complete your education at the American University in Beirut, and you took your law degree in London. So when you returned, what did you find, and how did you go about dealing with legal life and your own life under the occupation that you found when you came back to live in the West Bank in the 1970s?
Well, until then, my interest was primarily in writing a literary autobiography, and I was working on one and putting a lot of time in it, in addition to my law studies and practice and so on. But then when I came back to practice in the West Bank, I realized that I saw that the Israelis had changed the laws and repealed some of the Jordanian laws and added new ones and controlled the situation through military orders in a complete way. There was nothing left uncontrolled through military orders. And I realized that the world outside thought of the occupation as a benevolent occupation, which was contrary entirely to the truth. And I realized that the details of how this is happening, how Israel is controlling the occupied territories, is not known and needs to be studied and put forward to the world. So I started working on compiling a study of the legal changes, and in fact did a small book called The West Bank and the Rule of Law with Jonathan Kuttab, which I then realized that this kind of work needs to be beyond just myself. It has to have an organization behind it, because there's so much happening, so much violations to the international law and to local law and changes in the law, that we need an organization to deal with it. And so the idea of establishing Al-Haq came, and I was lucky to have colleagues who were amenable, and we together established Al-Haq, which also happened to be at the right time for the International Commission of Jurists, who were looking to deal with the situation here and expose it. And so when I was in Geneva testifying before the Committee to Investigate Israeli Practices, Neil McDermott, who was the Secretary General of the ICJ, told me that he was willing to co-publish the West Bank Rule of Law with Al-Haq, which was called Law in the Service of Man at that time. And then he was also willing to make Al-Haq an affiliate of the ICJ, which gave us a lot of strength and credibility. And so we started working as an affiliate of the ICJ and did tremendous amounts of work and studies and exposed the situation of what was happening to the world.
So, I mean, this was happening when you founded Al-Haq, I imagine, at the time when the situation on the West Bank was becoming very politicized amongst the Palestinians, when the PLO was making a great deal of political headway. There was the election of the PLO mayors, for instance, in the mid-70s. And, you know, the whole political atmosphere on the West Bank, especially, and of course in Gaza, was beginning to wind up towards the Intifada of 1987. Is that correct?
Yeah, Al-Haq was established in 1979. And at that time, there was no other organization dealing with the human rights violations, actually anywhere in the Arab world, except I think only in Cairo, there was one. And so it was a breakthrough, and it was amazing that we were able to do it under the Israeli occupation through all kinds of ways and means, and surreptitiously, and then slowly, when we were able to emerge, we finally emerged, and they couldn't stop us because of our affiliation with the ICJ. And so, yes, the PLO was doing its own work outside and was not really interested in what was happening in the West Bank of these legal changes, which they thought were as minor, and thought once they liberate the territory, they will demolish all these and abolish them, and there's no need to look into them and slowly study them and carefully pay attention to them. So there was a separation of outlook between our group here working on these matters and the PLO outside working on military liberation of Palestine.
So what were you able to achieve during those years?
Well, we succeeded in making the world aware of the changes, and we got a lot of media attention, and we were able to study and document all the violations, both legal and human rights, and so the record now is complete. Nobody can deny that the Israelis have violated and have been violating international law and human rights since 1979, when we established. We have a full record of what's happening here, and documentation, full documentation of the situation. And also, the colonial ways work through mystifying the colonized. So had we not done this work, it would have sounded very strange how we got to where we are here now, and how it happened that it grew from that time slowly through changes in the law and through civil administration and all that, and so on. And we demystified it by writing about it and documenting it and publishing our documentation and our analysis. And I think that is very important.
Yes, and of course you've been followed by many other similar NGOs since then, setting up, and it's made a very big difference. I want to go back to look at your father. As we said before, your father was very involved in legal aspects in many different ways and under all these different occupations. But you felt somehow distant from him. Do you think it was partly because he was away from you so much in the years of his exile, or because he had different ideas from you about how the liberation, as it were, of the Palestinians should take place? Or was it just one of those awkward father-son things that are so common sometimes? It's difficult for fathers to speak to sons and vice versa.
Well, it's all these matters to get all together. I think the psychological aspects of the relationship to my father is at the heart of the book. And it's something that I understood better through writing the book. And I think that essentially it is strange because we had so many similarities. So for example, when he was going through during the Jordan period, he was seeing the place that he knew very well, the West Bank, Ramallah, and so on, being changed into Jordanian, just as I was, as I was watching the West Bank being changed into Israeli territory, really, through the settlements and the developments that were taking place after '67. In fact, he wrote some articles which he signed Samid, the perseverant one, and I had signed as Samid some of the writings that I did after '67. And when I published a book called The Third Way, in which I wrote about Sumud and Samid, and my father read it, of course, he didn't point out to me that how strange it is that he used that same designation as I did. And so he kept silent. I think the difference between us, although we worked together for many years in the office and rather successfully worked together, I think that we were different types. He was an extrovert and I'm an introvert. And so we didn't deal with things in the same way and didn't have a similar way of behaving. And he enjoyed giving speeches. Well, I don't enjoy giving speeches, and so on. And so it's a matter of different types of people. And also, I think I was listening more to my mother and her criticism of my father. And my mother was always saying that why is he continuously getting involved with politics and with difficult matters and making our life more difficult? And she was blaming him, blaming the victim. And I sort of saw her point of view more than his. And he thought, for some reason, that he didn't have to explain to me anything. So when he came back from his exile, for example, he didn't sit down with me and tell me about the exile and his experiences and why he was exiled. And when he came back from prison, likewise, he didn't tell me anything. And so I was in the dark, really, about all these things. And it's also due to the fact that relationships in the Middle Eastern societies, I think, between fathers and sons, is not one where there is openness and speaking and emotional give and take. There is an assumption that the son follows the father and is obedient to the father. And I didn't like this relationship. I didn't want to be simply obedient. I wanted to have arguments with him. I wanted to confront him. And I think he took that badly, and it didn't create a good relationship between us. And so when I wrote the book, I discovered things about him and about his work that I had not been aware of. And I kept asking, why is it that I wasn't aware of these things? And why is it that I didn't appreciate him in his lifetime? And of course, there was the age difference. So when he died, he was 73. And now I'm 71. And I now realize that as you grow older, certain things happen, which I wasn't aware of at all. And I expected him to be as he always had been and didn't take into account his age. And that made also more difficulties, which I only now realize, and so on.
I think it's very sad, isn't it? I mean, he was a patriarchal figure, I suppose, and you didn't take to that, and you'd become distanced from him. But it's a shame, isn't it, that he died. He was murdered, in fact, in a separate issue, which I don't think we've got time to go into here, because it was a result of a court case. It doesn't seem to have been, as far as I can tell, a political assassination. But he was murdered in the early 1980s, before really you came into your own as a writer and started to become the great storyteller of Palestine and the great explainer, I think. One of the first of the great wave of literary and artistic people Palestinians who in different languages from their own and in Arabic, some translated, spread the word about Palestine, put Palestine on the map. And you've done an extraordinary job in all your books of telling people about the reality of Palestine. In fact, it's through people like you that Palestine seems to be getting more and more real every day, despite the dreadful situation and extension and intensification of the Israeli occupation. Could you tell us about your writing and how you got into that and how important you think that is, and all the people who followed you on that course?
Well, I've always been interested in writing, and my interest really was more in literary writing than in legal analysis or political analysis. But I've had to do that because I thought there was need to do it. And I also, in many of my books, I've written about my father and our relationship. And so many people who have come to see this book thought that it might be a repetition of the earlier books because they had read about my relationship to my father as I wrote it in earlier books. But of course, this is not at all like the other books. It's a entirely different and an entirely different take on it, and much more expensive, and it goes into the psychological aspects greatly, and is also about my father and his achievements, giving him his full rights. Of course, I always realized that, or I came to realize that, had my father not been murdered and his life cut short, there might have been the possibility that we could have grown closer together as time went on. And this was prevented by the murder. And of course, the murder meant that I had to spend years fighting with the Israeli police to get them to investigate the case. And in fact, the fight still goes on until today, because I'm still asking the police to give me access to the file of the murder, to show me what they did and how they failed to pursue the real murderer, who was the case that my father had been fighting for the church property. And so
Sorry. No, Raja, I was just going to say one thing. I just wanted to ask you one last question, because time, the great enemy, is encroaching on us. It's been so fascinating; it's slipped by. I just wanted to ask you, this what I described as a surge of Palestinian art, the costumes, the food, the writing, the descriptions, the stories, the novels, which has been really increasing, a sort of cascade of it since the early, I would say, the early 1980s. This is surely, don't you think, and you're of course a leading light in all this, this has surely made a massive difference to the global appreciation of the plight of the Palestinians and the need for something very serious to be done about it by their governments.
Yes, I do think that. And I think that if there was a miracle, it's not the establishment of Israel and the success of Israel. The miracle is that the Israelis were able to deny that the Palestinians lived here and that the Nakba happened, and continue to deny it to this day. And so the Palestinians feel as if they are negated, as if they are not confirmed as having existed and as real. And so they can go overboard sometimes in writing and showing that this is not true through all the manifestations of culture, Palestinian culture, that is happening more and more, and which is a denial of what Ben Gurion thought. He thought that give the Palestinians a few generations and they will forget about Palestine. And in fact, the opposite is happening. Rather than forgetting about Palestine, the new generations are even more Palestinian and more attached to Palestine than were their forefathers. And so it's very important what is happening, I think, today. The only trouble or the only tragedy is that it's not being followed. Although it's having an effect on the populations of the Western countries, it's not being followed by their change of policy of their governments. So for example, and you know better, of course, there is a change in the attitude of the population towards Palestinians and Israel, but that's not equated or it does not affect the policies of the British government. And
well, Raja, that's something we here at the Balfour Project and along with our colleagues in other organizations work on very hard to try to shift the opinion of the government as well as the civil society. I'm going to hand over now because we are running out of time. I hope some questions will refer to the current situation, which I haven't touched on because I was fascinated by your book and I wanted to get out as much as we could about that, about the current situation with the intensification of the occupation and of course this extremely rabid right-wing government, which has been elected in Israel last year. Dee, over to you. Thank you very much, Raja. That was absolutely fascinating.
Thank you, Tim.
Hello, thank you, Raja. That was fantastic. And we've had loads of comments of support and queries about your book. I've posted in the chat box how to how to purchase Raja's new book. So please do check out the chat box for that. We will be sending out an email to our mailing list with the recording of this event, as well as the link to purchase the book. So please do keep an eye out for that. We've had loads of messages of support. As I said, we had one from Gemma S, which I just want to mention because it's from Vilnius in Lithuania. And I don't think we've had anyone from Lithuania present themselves so far. So again, just thought I'd pull that out there. I have one question from Nada Pretnar that hopefully you can help. It's not about the current situation. Can Raja suggest a book which specifically analyzes the role of the Hashemites Jordan in the period of 1948 to 67 in the West Bank? Bit niche, but I thought you might be the best person to ask that of.
Well, Avi Schleim has written a biography of King Hussein, the line of Hussein, the line of something, and that has a lot about the rule of King Hussein over the period of his long rule. So this could be one possibility. Fantastic,
thank you. I have an amazing question from the amazing. Oh, sorry, what was that?
The Lion of Jordan. Lion of Jordan.
Fantastic, thank you. I've got a question from the amazing Paul Hughes Smith. Hi Raja, good to see you. Do you think the continual attempt by Israel and those who support the Zionist cause will ever succeed in expunging the Palestinian narrative from history? Prescribing organizations such as Al-Haq is a small part of this agenda, but I fear there is worse to come.
My fear is that there is worse to come as well, because the present government has no sensitivity to world opinion. But I must say that Al-Haq has succeeded so far in staying put and in convincing the European governments to continue their support of Al-Haq and deny that Israel has any real cause for calling the organization terrorist. And that's something that in a sense is unprecedented. I mean, the Israeli military came and posted a order on the door of Al-Haq that this organization is closed. And what they did was to take the order, tear it up, and open the door and go back in and continue to work as before. And that is, I think, amazing opposition, and they have so far succeeded in doing this. But of course, the present Israeli government calls human rights organizations, both in Israel and in the West Bank, as enemies of the state. And even those who are in Israel also are called enemies of the state. So I think bad times, worse times are going to come, and we have to be ready for them.
Thank you, Raja. I have a depressing but important question from Walid Marmal. Is Oslo dead? If so, what is the alternative solution to the conflict?
Well, you know, the good thing is that people now know the truth about Oslo, which of course they didn't know for the longest time, because in a way the accords, the agreement is rather complicated, and the Israelis were very clever in how they put forward details that made a big difference in the life of the place and in levels of jurisdiction and I don't know what, and complicated legal matters which an ordinary person might not have immediately fathomed. And so for a while, people thought the Oslo would be a temporary thing and we would go beyond it to full liberation and Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank and Gaza. But now, of course, I don't think anybody has any delusions about Oslo. At the same time, it's very difficult to know how to deal with the matter, because the Oslo has created the Palestinian Authority, and the Palestinian Authority has so many responsibilities over the life of the Palestinians. And if the only thing if it ceases to exist, then Israel will have to take over everything that they're doing now. And perhaps this is a good thing to do, but would the Palestinian Authority have the courage and the ability to do that? That is a very big question, and it's a difficult question to answer.
Thank you, Raja. Actually, Tim, I've got one for you, if you don't mind. This one is from Jane de Rene. I hope I'm saying that right. How can Balfour Project defend those who dare to put their head above the parapet and criticize the state of Israel and or publicly support the Palestinian cause, specifically against things such as being accused of being anti-Semitic, falsely accused?
I don't understand the question. Could you repeat it?
Sorry, I'll repeat the question. How can the Balfour Project defend those or support those who dare to put their head above the parapet and criticize the state of Israel and or publicly support the Palestinian cause, in specific against false accusations of being anti-Semitic?
Well, of course, this is a whole new, terribly complicated ball game we have with this new interpretation of anti-Semitism, which we will be discussing later in the year in depth, I hope, in which it's regarded as anti-Semitic to criticize the state of Israel. And this stems largely from the IHRA definition, which has been taken on board by so many institutions. And without going into too much detail, what it's done is it's had an enormous effect on suppressing honest debate about Israel because of the fear people have, quite rightly, of being accused of anti-Semitism. But of course, so many of these charges of anti-Semitism, which have been hurled around, have come from agents and supporters of the Israeli government. It's part of their Hasbara propaganda technique. And it has been proved that most of these charges are without any foundation whatsoever. This isn't to say there isn't anti-Semitism, but the sort of anti-Semitism that I think your questioner is talking about is the one that's confused with criticizing the state of Israel, which everybody has the right to do. Everybody has the right to criticize a state, just as I had the right to criticize my own state for invading Iraq, or Americans had the right to criticize their own state for invading Vietnam, and so on. So I don't have any time for this argument at all. The Balfour Project, as I understand it, stands for equal rights for everybody in the Holy Land, in the land between the river and the sea. And that is our position. And we are not going to be frightened off that course of action, that support for the Palestinians by false charges of anti-Semitism.
Thank you, Tim. And of course, we have loads of resources on the website. We've got resources for educators. We have all of our past webinars on there. And I'm just posting Sorry, I've just realized I've done something very 2020 and left myself on mute. I was trying to say that we have lots of resources on our website. We have resources for educators on our website. We have all of our past webinars, the recordings of our past webinars, and I'm just about to post in the chat box our brochure from our conference last year on abandoning Palestine. So those are all things that can be used as, I don't want to use the word ammo on this better word, ammo in terms of your arguments and support for your arguments going forward. So please do check out, in particular, our conference brochure. If you are interested in a hard copy version of it, please do get in touch. I'll put my email in the chat box if you don't have it already. Get in touch. We do ask because we call it a booklet. It's a book. It's massive. So we would really very much appreciate a bit of a donation to help cover the costs of postage and so forth. So do get in touch and we will send one out to you if you would like a hard copy. So I've got a question for you, Raja, about your father from Hillel Schenker. I know that your father led a small Palestinian delegation to the 1949 Rhodes Armistice talk with the goal of having a Palestinian participation in the discussions. The approach was rejected by both the Israelis and the Jordanians, and I was wondering if you found any information in his papers or in his diaries about that experience.
Well, the fact is that he went to Lausanne, not to the Rhodes, to put forward the Palestinian case, and in Lausanne he was with Hawari and another person, and the three-man delegation was refused audience by all the participants in the Lausanne conference, and which was a UN conference. And so after trying to put forward the case, he returned back home and felt very disappointed at the refusal to have a hearing for his case and for the Palestinian case. And he continued to tell the Israelis, you are always refusing to listen to the Palestinians and you're refusing any chance to make peace with the Palestinians. And this was true then and it's true now. And has never been, the Israelis never faltered in refusing any attempt by the Palestinians to make peace with them, whether it's with PLO, whether it's Hamas, whether it's anybody. They're always saying that there's no partner to make peace with, and that is absolutely a lie. It was the case and still is the case.
Thank you, Raja. Just a comment from Naomi saying thank you both for a superb illuminating interview. I just thought you'd like to hear those very kind words. Got a question from Bruce Stanley. Are there still options for legal cases against the British for their failures and seizures of Palestinian assets and war crimes during and at the end of the mandate?
Well, I always thought that there is a case to be made for the leaving Jaffa and the parts of Palestine that were under the Arab jurisdiction according to the partition scheme, leaving these unprotected by withdrawing early in 1948. So the responsibility of the British in Palestine was to keep protecting the Palestinians and Israelis in that area. And what they did was to withdraw, leaving the Palestinians under the thumb and under the attacks by the Haganah and Irgun. And as a result, the Palestinians felt unprotected, and many of them had to leave their homes in fright or were expelled out of their home. And I think the British had the responsibility until the end of the mandate to protect the Palestinians, which they failed to do. And I would believe there is a case there to be tried against the British for their withdrawal without protecting the Palestinians.
It's just fascinating. Thank you so much. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to the, I'm going to pass over to the final question in a minute, but I do just want to say it's that time where I get my begging cap out, and maybe Tim would like to help me with the begging today. But we like to host these webinars for free. We want to be able to educate as many people as possible on different issues with regards to Israel-Palestine, equal area, and so forth. We would really appreciate a donation if you can, if you could spare the cost of a coffee or anything like that. Or better yet, if you become a friend of the Balfour Project, then not only do we love you very, very much, but you also receive benefits such as discounted or free tickets to some of our paid events. For example, we will have discounted tickets for our friends to the in-person conference that we're going to be having on the 17th of May in London. We also have, we're going to be having regular friends meetings with different key people within the Balfour Project. So we had our first one at the end of last year, where we had our chair, Andrew Whitley, and our vice chair, Sir Vincent Veen, as well as the chair of our executive committee, Sandra Humrouni. And I think it was about 25 of our different friends on a Zoom call where we were able to update them fully and receive questions and feedback from them. So lots of benefits of being a friend, namely that you're supporting us and being able to focus more on our charitable work rather than the admin and the stress of trying to secure that constant funding. So yes, like I said, I'll be posting those links in the chat room, in the chat box. In the meantime, I'm going to be asking the final question for Raja. Thank you for a wonderful talk. This is from David French. Could you remind us what are the current Jewish and Palestinian populations in Israel and the occupied territories, if you have them? But most importantly, what do you see as the implications when the latter, the Palestinians, overtakes the former in numbers? This is a subject that comes up regularly, our demographic terrorism, right? So over to you, Raja.
Well, I think by now there is almost parity between the number of Jews and the number of Palestinian Arabs in Greater Israel, Palestine. But then the issue is not the numbers, I think. And the fact is that by keeping the Palestinians, whether in Israel proper or in the West Bank and Gaza, under discriminatory laws and system of rule, then there is an apartheid system, which that doesn't matter if it's the numbers are 7 million or 5 million or 3 million. The fact is that there is a substantial number of Palestinians, and they are under Israeli military rule, discriminated against, and Israel does not seem to be wanting to treat them as equal citizens or as equal human beings to the Jewish Israelis. And that's the issue, and it doesn't really matter the numbers, because even if the numbers change, the policy is not going to change.
Thank you so much.
Do we have time for just one more question from me?
Of course.
I hope so. Raja, I'll just put this very quickly. Of course, we've seen this new, very right-wing, very right-wing settler-dominated government take power in Israel with all sorts of dire warnings about the future. Now, I've noticed two sorts of reactions in the West and amongst liberals in Israel itself, broadly, book reviews about all this and comments. It seems that we hear, the opinion is that, oh my God, what's happened? This wonderful democracy of Israel has suddenly stopped and it's become something else and it's going down a wrong path. I mean, the latest column by Thomas Friedman in the New York Times is an extreme example of this. I suspect that the reaction in Palestine and amongst Palestinians is slightly different. Could you elaborate on that briefly for us before we wind up?
Yes, I would say that nobody called apartheid South Africa a democracy because it had an apartheid rule. And likewise with Israel, it cannot be called a democracy. It couldn't have been called a democracy and cannot be called a democracy as long as it has Palestinians that are living under occupation and in Israel under discriminatory rules and laws. And so the fact that now this government is speaking openly against discrimination and superiority of the Jews and so on in Israel is perhaps a welcome change, because it opens the lid to and removes the facade of everything is fine and everything is cheerful for Israel. And I think the most preposterous thing that has happened under this government is to call the ICJ opinion for getting the status of the occupied territories, an opinion from the International Court of Justice on the status of the occupied territories, to call it Palestinian diplomatic terrorism. I think that's the most preposterous thing that could to add terrorism to Palestinian diplomatic moves is amazing. And then the Prime Minister has just told the American visitor to Israel, the latest moves by the Palestinians in the international arena are an attack on Israel and oblige us to respond. Well, if they don't want Palestinian diplomatic moves, what do they want? How do they want the Palestinians to respond to all these policies that Israel is perpetrating against us?
Thank you, Raja.
Well, it's time to say thank you very much for the both of you. We've had loads of comments thanking you both for an illuminating talk and discussion. Like I said, everyone in the audience, if you do post anything in the chat box, I will make sure that Raja and Tim see it, so they will receive your comments. Raja, Tim, you've been amazing. You've been fantastic. This webinar has been recorded. It will be going up on the website tomorrow. Please urge you to share it with anyone that you think will be that will be interested in it. We would love to have to help spread awareness on this issue and educate people as far and wide as we can. So thank you so much. And let me remind you that we have another webinar coming up on the 2nd of February with Ray Dolphin, formerly of UN OCHA. So do join us then if you can. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Raja. Thank you, audience. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.